Hello, Sophie. Welcome to At Home with Austen for a Bit Lit, and thank you for joining me.
Not at all. Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome. So I'm very excited to chat to you today. Do you want to start off by just telling us who you are?
Yeah, of course. My name's Sophie Reynolds, and I'm the Collections and Interpretation Manager at Jane Austen's house, which is in Chawton, which is a tiny village in the middle of Hampshire. It's in quite a rural area. We're quite off the beaten track. And it's the house where Jane Austen lived for the last 8 years of her life. And it's where everything sort of came together for her, and she finally had a sort of stable home of her own. And it's where finally the novels started to be published, and it's there that she managed to rewrite, edit, and write from scratch. So some of them were already in draft form, and then it's from where all six of the novels were published. So it's the real home, we like to think. It's also, luckily for us, actually the only house where Jane Austen lived which still survives and is open to the public.
Wow.
So it's also the home of our Jane Austen collection, and Jane Austen artifacts are spread all over the world. There are lots in America, but in the UK, certainly Jane Austen's house is where a lot of those artifacts are brought together. So we're an accredited
Fabulous.
museum. We're very small, but it's a very sort of rich, and it's an incredibly emotional experience to visit the museum. We get visitors from all over the world, and people, very often cry when they get there, or
Wow.
when they reach the dining room and they see the tiny little table that Jane Austen wrote at. I
Mm.
think it's an incredibly emotional thing for people. So yeah, I feel incredibly lucky to have my job. I've been doing it for just over 2 years, and I think that's just long enough to feel like I'm not the new girl anymore. I feel like I know what I'm doing. And we're a very, very small team. So even though my job title is one thing, we will end up doing loads of things. And I've done everything from kind of shoveling snow, getting there to open up in the morning, cleaning, sort of bit of everything. But yeah,
Fabulous.
I'm in charge of the house, the collection, and the interpretation, which is basically means everything that we say about the house
Mm.
and the objects. So it's kind of telling the story.
Wonderful. And I feel like you gave us a lovely little hint of sort of what that story is there in talking about what it sort of meant for Austen to find a home, and the fact that it really sounds as if it inspired a lot of her creativity being in this home. Could you give us, for those who are less familiar with kind of the shape of Austen's life, a bit of a sense of which novels had she written by this point? What was she working on? What was she editing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't always know exactly, but to give you a very quick sort of sketch of what Jane Austen's life had looked like by the time she arrived in Chawton, she actually grew up very close by. She was born in Steventon, which is about 13 miles away in Hampshire, and she grew up there until she was 21. And she was writing all the time when she was a young girl, when she was a teenager. She's writing loads kind of sketches and stories. They're very silly, kind of crazy, quite wild, full of heroines who are doing dreadful things. Then quite suddenly, dramatically, her father announces that he's going to retire. He's a clergyman. He announces that he's going to retire and move the family to Bath. And all the brothers are okay because they, have their own things. They have jobs, they have wives and houses. But Mrs. Austen and Jane and Cassandra, her sister, basically they have to go with the parents. So they go to Bath. Then her father dies quite suddenly, and Jane Austen has written quite a lot by this time. She's written a number of things. We think she's definitely written Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, but under other names, and they're in different forms to how we know them now, but they're kind of sketched out. Then there's this kind of wilderness period. So her father has died. They don't have much money, so it's quite awkward, actually. They aspire, I mean, not even aspire, they belong to a certain class. So they have to maintain a degree of kind of, outward show, I think you'd say, maybe. But they don't have much money. So they're kind of scrabbling around to make things work, and they're moving from place to place. They live in Bath, they live in rented accommodation, and they're kind of moving from flat to flat, basically. And it's getting like worse, like they're moving to smaller and less good apartments.
Wow.
Then they moved to Southampton, and they're living with their brother Frank and his wife, and he's actually in the Navy and he goes to sea, but he kind of leaves them in a house with his new wife. So it's all quite difficult. She isn't really writing that much during that period. But I don't know, there were all sorts of arguments about whether she hated Bath, whether she loved Bath, whatever it wasn't a great writing situation. It was probably just too busy, I think. She was, she was having a social life. And, anyone who's a writer will know that's not great. You really want to be stuck at home, snowed in, and sort of have nothing else to do. If you're going to balls every night and going to parties and concerts and going to the theatre and paying visits, it's just not that much time. And also, they're moving around into different houses and flats, so there's just not much space. And then eventually, in 1809, her brother Edward, who is actually the second brother, but through a kind of convoluted quirk of fate, has inherited this huge sort of fortune and several great estates. He comes forward about time, I think, and says, I will give the ladies in the family, he'll give his mother and his two sisters a house to live in. And he can easily afford it. He has many houses in his gift. So he gives them this house in Chawton, which is on his Chawton estate. He has the big house just up the road, the manor. He doesn't actually live there. He actually is mainly based in Kent, where he has yet another big house. But they moved to Chawton, and it's kind of known as the cottage, which is quite surprising for people nowadays, because you get there and it's not really a cottage. It's a beautiful house. It's very big. But by their standards, it wasn't great. It was fine, but it wasn't luxurious. Anyway, so she finally has this place, which is in the country. She loved Bath or didn't love Bath. She enjoys London or whatever. We think she did actually quite like city life, but she's back in the country, quiet, and she is living with her mother, her sister Cassandra, and their friend Martha Lloyd. So they have this slightly unconventional all-female household going on. Oh, wow. And essentially the others they look after her. They take over all the household management. Cassandra in particular is really good at sort of, taking everything under herself, and they manage, all the household jobs. Jane has a couple of little jobs that she has to do, like making the breakfast and looking after the wine, which she is perfectly happy to do. And then she has the rest of her time to write, at which point she starts to pull out her manuscripts again. So she definitely has manuscripts for Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Northanger Abbey, which had been previously known as Susan. And she had actually sold to a publisher, and then they hadn't published it, and she bought it back. It was all quite messy and awkward. And the first thing she does when they get to Chawton is to get out the manuscript of Sense and Sensibility and brush it up, polish it. We don't know. Oh, it's just so frustrating. We don't know exactly what happened, because in those days, original manuscripts weren't kept. They were destroyed once the book was published, which is just so frustrating. But we do know, obviously we know what the outcome was. So Sense and Sensibility is published. And then Pride and Prejudice comes later, and then Emma. And then, she's sort of on a bit of a wave. She's riding the wave once she's in Chawton. And then it's just so heartbreaking, because actually she then dies. And it's quite sudden and quite dramatic. She's 41, and they've been in Chawton about just over 8 years. And she's been getting ill for about the last year, but has been kind of struggling on and telling everyone she's fine and having days in bed, but then kind of pulling everything together and telling everyone. She's writing all these letters, which are just heartbreaking, because she's always telling everyone that she's okay and that she's much better now and it's all, it's fine.
Yeah.
And then they go to Winchester, and then sadly she dies.
Gosh.
And then the story of the house is quite extraordinary, actually, because Jane herself has died, but Martha actually has her own brilliant story, because she ends up marrying one of the other Austen brothers, who, so she has a sort of fairy tale ending at the age of 60.
Oh, wow. And this is
quite unusual. This is their friend who was living with them. Yeah. Cassandra and the mother stay, and Cassandra lives there until 1845, when she dies. And then the house, which actually belongs to the Chawton estate, which is owned by Edward Knight, the house goes back to the estate. And it's quite interesting. It's sort of broken up into tenements, into flats, and it's lived in by people who work on the estate. So it's actually split into 3 separate sort of dwellings, and there's an estate office in there as well, so where they sort of do the rents and things.
Gosh, so it's very much less a domestic space after having been such a home.
And it's at the heart of the village, so it's kind of this, it's right on the main road, and it's lived in by all these different people. And I don't know, like, under any circumstances, it's quite difficult to have a building which is occupied by lots of different people. You know, no one is quite taking responsibility for things and keeping it, you know, the upkeep. So it slightly falls into a bit of disrepair, and it's sort of not in the best way. And years go by, and different people live there, and things happen. You know, the garden sort of, you know, goes to rack and ruin or whatever. And then, this is just so magical. It's like a fairy tale. In 1840, there's a woman who lives in Alton, which is the next town. It's just half a mile away. It's very, very close. And she would go walking in Chawton and walk past the house. And she was a huge fan of Jane Austen. And she knew that this was the house where Jane Austen had lived. And she just thought it was heartbreaking. You know, she thought, this is so sad. This house is just sitting there. It's quite neglected, and nobody knows that that's where Jane Austen lived. And, you know, it's just sort of sinking into oblivion. And she thought, I want to do something to save the house. And there's this amazing story that one day she walked past and she saw that the tenants in that part of the house had ripped out the iron grate that used to be in the dining room, because they wanted to have a gas fire, because it's 1940. I mean, you know, they want the mod cons. So they had taken the grate and they'd thrown it into a pile of nettles in the garden. So Dorothy Donnell sees it and she's like, not having that. So she gets the grate and she arranges for it to go into Alton, to go to the Curtis Museum, where it can be looked after. And then she thinks, this is kind of a catalyst for her thinking, right, okay, I'm going to do something. And what she does is starts up the Jane Austen Society, which today is a huge organization. And actually there are Jane Austen societies all over the world. But it started with this sort of tiny little thing. And there's one woman, and actually the first thing she did, she was the first member. Her sister was the second member. So, you know, it's sort of like a family thing, but it grows. And they set out to raise some money to rescue the house. And what they do, because it's 1940 and this is like, there's no social media, they write letters to the newspapers and they put they put adverts in the papers. And they got quite lucky because they didn't actually raise enough money to buy the house, which by the way, I should just say, the house has now been put up for sale. So they know that it's possible to rescue it.
Right.
But they don't quite raise enough money themselves, but they do attract the attention of somebody who does have enough money, who was a London lawyer who lived in Mill Hill. I think it's quite random. He's called Mr. T. Edward Carpenter, and he is the museum's fairy godfather, because he decided that he would simply buy the house outright, set it up as a museum. And it's also incredibly sad because his son, we're now in 1944, his son had just been killed in action in Italy. And he decided that what he wanted to do was to open the house up to the public, to the nation, as a museum in memory of Jane Austen, but also in memory of his son. So we're also a war memorial. We have a plaque on the front wall. So he bought the house and they set up the Jane Austen Memorial Trust, which was a lot of the same people as the Jane Austen Society at that time, actually. Like a lot of the sort of local people who were really interested in Jane Austen and wanted to, you know, sort of be part of the story. And the museum got a new roof, which was important. And we'll come back to that later, probably. But that was 1948. And then in 1949, it was open to the public. However, it was still full of all its tenants. So it was actually lived in. So there was one room at that time, which was open to the public. It was the drawing room. And all the tenants thought it was really inconvenient, actually. They didn't like having people knock on their door and like ask to see around.
Yeah.
Which is fair enough, actually. So they had to raise some more money and they ended up buying, this is just extraordinary, they ended up buying other houses that they could move the tenants into.
Wow.
And then eventually it took quite a number of years, they sort of opened up, they freed up the rest of the house, basically, until, as it is today, most of it is now open to the public. Some of it is offices. And then they also had to start building a collection because it was empty. There was really nothing there.
Right. It was just,
because
I guess,
it had been
the
lived
walls
in.
and the floor. Yeah.
Exactly. So the Jane Austen Society had some money and they helped buy things. And Mr. Carpenter went out and bought things. I mean, he literally went to auctions and went to Sotheby's and kept an eye out, and they would write letters to each other saying things like, oh, I've seen this in this shop, or I've seen this come up for sale, like, do you want it? And he'd be like, yes, we want that.
Wow. And so just to interrupt for a second. So some of these things presumably would be objects, say, owned by Jane Austen, but was this also things to do with Austen's, success in the wider world, or was it objects from the right period to create a sense of Jane Austen?
It was mainly what they were after were specific Jane Austen artifacts, so things that she had owned.
Right, yeah.
Today, we do have objects which are of the period. Not that many, actually, but we have objects to dress the house as well. But what they were really after, and it's incredibly charming, we have in the archive, we have a newspaper cutting from the Times, I think, where they had put in an advert saying Jane Austen's scraps wanted. And they were literally appealing to anyone who might have something that was connected with Jane Austen. And they got such a great response. I mean, they did actually manage to collect some really extraordinary things. So we have some items of furniture that came from Steventon Rectory. One of the best stories, I think, about objects coming into the collection took place in 1949. So this was at the opening sort of ceremony for the house, for the museum. And they've got a marquee and they're doing speeches and things to sort of open the house. And Mr. Carpenter is making his speech, and he starts slightly tactlessly, actually, I think. He starts going on about how it's really bad when objects are bought up by Americans and taken back to America. And he goes, his example is like, well, recently there was an auction and a lock of Jane Austen's hair was sold at auction to an American, and it's gone back to America, and isn't this shocking and awful? So anyway, the woman, you just couldn't write this stuff. The woman who bought the lock of hair is in the audience. She's called Alberta Burke. And she apparently mutters under her breath, well, if they want the hair, I'll give them the damn hair. And then she stands up in the middle of his speech and she says, I am the American who bought the lock of hair, and if you want it, then I will donate it to you. I'll give it to you for the museum. And, there's absolute uproar in the marquee, and everything is absolute carnage, and they're all absolutely beside themselves and delighted. Wow. So we have a lock of hair that belonged to Jane Austen, and it has been DNA tested. So it is Jane Austen's hair. It's just sort of absolutely extraordinary. Wow. So there are all sorts of amazing stories like that sort of, bring together this very sort of extraordinary collection of things that she owned, things that belonged to her, things that she used, lots of books, lots of first editions, things like that.
Wonderful. And what's really lovely there is that there's a resonance, of course, with her literature, but it's sort of life imitating art, right? Because the lock of hair in Sense and Sensibility of Marianne's hair is so significant. And here
absolutely.
Austen's own hair having such, again, significance for posterity.
Yeah. There are so many of those kind of resonances and similarities, all the time.
And do you find that, because I think you've given a really clear vision of how important this finding a home and finding a place where she could actually reflect and write was important to Jane Austen's work. Do you think we find those sorts of interests cropping up in her novels as well? Is she sort of writing about getting to the point she's finally arrived at, that kind of search for a home?
Yeah, I think so. And actually, it's interesting because one of our kind of missions at the museum, I think, at the moment, is to kind of really debunk the idea that Jane Austen's novels are about romance and about finding a husband. I mean, they're not. I mean, they are in some sense. They're definitely about that. That is the sort of the plot structure in some way.
Kind of the framework. Yeah.
It's a framework, exactly. But really, I think they're so much more interesting than that. They're about women and how a woman who has at that time very few sort of legal rights, a woman at that point, if she got married, all of her property would belong to her husband. It was very unusual for a woman of a certain rank to work. So a woman really had to get married in order to sort of have a secure future. And getting married probably meant having children, which was pretty risky. I mean, very likely to die in childbirth, particularly with the sort of size families that they were having. If you were going to have 10 children, it's pretty likely actually at some point you wouldn't make it. So there are lots of things going on in Jane Austen's novels, which people at the time, I think the reason that we miss them today is that she was writing for an audience that just knew all of this. It was just in their blood. It was in their bones. They'd
just
grown
took it
up.
for granted.
Just took it for granted. And there are so many things like that in there that we completely miss. And houses are a real part of that. And all of the novels make houses an incredibly important sort of plot device and incredibly important to the heroine. So, I mean, the most obvious example, obviously, is Sense and Sensibility, where, it's all about your house has been taken away from you.
Yes.
You need another one. I mean, it's that simple. And having found another one for the sort of family unit, Marianne and Eleanor actually need to find houses of their own. And it's very difficult because you don't want to just marry anyone. And Jane Austen knew that so well from her own life story. I mean, she had a proposal and could have married someone, and actually it wasn't the right person, and that potentially would have been a real problem for her. Certainly would have meant we didn't have any novels. And she, it's this wonderful story where she accepts in the evening and then has this sleepless night, and then the next day says, I'm really sorry, actually, I can't marry you, I have to go now. And, comes home and never sort of goes there again.
And the significance of that sleepless night for literary history is just astonishing.
Exactly. So I think during that sleepless night, she was thinking, I could have Manydown Park. I could live here. I could have this great house, huge wealth. He's the brother of her two best friends. He must have been pretty bad, I think, in order for all of those things to not make her go along with it. But the house sort of symbolizes freedom in a way. If you get the right man and the right house, you are essentially buying your independence. I mean, a form of independence. And it's kind of as much independence as a woman was really likely to get at that stage.
Completely.
And it's just so lucky for her, but also obviously for us, that Jane Austen achieved an even greater kind of independence through sort of being, through not marrying people, through not getting married, not having children, refusing to go down that route, which was really what everyone said you had to do.
Yes.
Then she ended up with her house of her own. And it is interesting that none of her heroines did that. But I guess that was just a bit too far. She was asking people to believe that this is what they would do. And the question of marrying someone that was at least someone you loved was pretty radical in its own right. So she is pushing the bar quite heavily. And I do think that if we look at them and just think, they're romances, they're kind of, chick lit, it's scraping the surface, that is top line stuff. Whereas actually there's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Completely. And I think it's so interesting what you're saying about, yes, she never created a vision of a woman alone or a woman with just female family members able to live sort of happily ever after, as perhaps we could say she did. But she does, all her novels have these heroines who are being forced, as you say, because they're dependent on sort of other people's whims and they haven't got a household of their own, and they're being forced to, I'm thinking of Anne Elliot having to go to Bath against her will. And then obviously Mansfield Park is all about being sort of farmed out to a great house without choosing to, and just all these people having to be taken along because they don't have kind of power of their own fate. But then she also shows Charlotte Lucas sort of having to attempt to say, I sit in this room a lot by myself and he does gardening, to try and not be with Mr. Collins all the time, and showing how actually marriage, on the one hand, it gives you power and a a domain of your own, but on the other hand, there are some ways your freedom can be affected through that as well. You're still not in complete control of your space. And I also find
telling it like it is, isn't she? She's saying to her readership, sure, you probably actually aren't going to get to be Lizzie Bennet. You probably are going to be Charlotte Lucas. So you will have to say yes and marry someone who isn't great. But look, there are ways to kind of make the best of the situation. So whoever you are, you know, whichever character you identify with or you end up living their story, she kind of makes things okay. She sort of shows you how that might work. Even if you're Lydia, she kind of shows, you know, like, it's not great, it's not really a role model, but if that's what happens, you know, she doesn't just write them off. She kind of continues the story enough.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that you can see, yeah, you're right. It's not simply this woman is fallen, therefore she is gone, wiped off the page. You get to see Lydia sort of using her own rebellious wit to find a way to find her own sort of happy ending or solution.
Yeah, but Lydia doesn't get to have a house. I mean, that is one thing that she kind of is sort of her punishment in a way, I suppose, is that she's kind of moving around. They go to Newcastle, they're living in camp. Like, she hasn't succeeded in the way that she should have done. You know, like her marriage hasn't brought her what it was supposed to.
Yes, that's really interesting. So she remains sort of itinerant. She remains not having that sense of a place that was so important to Austen. And I find it really interesting that as you mentioned in Sense and Sensibility, obviously they lose a house, they find a house, but then the heroines have to find other houses. And yet actually for Austen, the time she was able to be creative was when she was in that situation with her mother and her sister, just like Marianne and Eleanor and Margaret and their mother. And the idea that that's the thing that has to be broken up in order to allow the romance plot to do its work is actually the place she arrived at.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of bittersweet, isn't it? I mean, I think if she had left Eleanor and Marianne living in Barton Cottage with their mother for the rest of their lives, we would have all felt like that wasn't a very happy ending. But actually for Austen, I think it really was. I think that was a very, you know, she came to a place where that was where she wanted to be.
Totally. And you might not have an answer for this, but when you were telling the story of her life and you mentioned the sort of the tragic death, over the years, I've read a couple of sort of plausible or quite outlandish theories of what it was that this sort of sudden horrendous illness was. Do you personally have any sort of thoughts or theories about this?
Yeah. So we've worked with someone who had consulted with a doctor, and they have various theories. And I'm going to get all the words wrong, I think, but we think it was probably a kind of cancer. Possibly Hodgkin's lymphoma. There are various sort of things that she writes in her letters that suggest that it could have been that, because she has some weird symptoms that she talks about. She talks about her skin going black and white and all sorts of colours, things like that. So there are some strange things which do add up. But you're right, it's kind of one of those things that there are so many theories, and it's arsenic poisoning, or it's this, or it's that. And I mean, I don't really know, but it's not something that I feel like I really need to know. I sort of feel like, you know, in that time, life was much cheaper in a way. You know, they didn't have the sort of medicine that we have today, and everything was a bit more on the edge. You know, people died. That was completely, that just happened much more often. You know, it just sort of came and went. And whilst Jane Austen was incredibly dear to her family, and we know from reading letters, particularly from Cassandra, her sister, that her death was a huge blow to her, and it left a huge hole. She also writes about how she's just very stoical, and she writes about how, you know, she's going to carry on, and it's, you know, she just has to get on with things. And I think that actually in that time when, you know, particularly children died all the time, illnesses, they didn't understand illness in the same way. So it just happens to be incredibly tragic for us because it was Jane Austen, and we really want to have more novels than she left for us. But actually, I think at the time it wasn't, in a way, that it wasn't uncommon. So yeah, no, it's a sort of rambly answer, but no,
it was a really interesting answer, because I think you're right, though. It's really interesting to know that there has been research working with specialists to kind of unpick what those symptoms mean. But you're right that yeah, in terms of how she understood it and in terms of how her family understood it, there are actually very different contexts for thinking about death. And it also gives a clearer idea of the stakes in, say, Pride and Prejudice, when Jane is made to catch the cold, is made to go riding in the rain, and the fact that her mother's willing for her to take that risk when life and death are so much more stark. It's so much more likely that there could be a terrible outcome.
Absolutely. And in Sense and Sensibility, you know, Marianne sort of suddenly gets ill, and you're kind of thinking like, oh, well, why is she ill? Like, you know,
she's just a bit overwrought. She just needs to have a lie down.
But I think to an original reader that would have felt very real, and like very likely that she would actually die. Like, that's quite a real concern. And just while we're talking about things that the sort of original readers would have noticed, I do think another really interesting point about Austen is that so many people, sort of one of the accusations that is levied against her is that she writes about women and domesticity and love and marriage, and that she kind of misses out all of the kind of big world affairs that were going on. And actually, it's just not true. It's just that with our modern eyes, we don't see them. So there are actually a lot of references that she just throws in, like very small. She just makes an allusion to this or that. And we skim over things because, you know, you see a word you don't quite understand, or an allusion you don't understand, you just carry on. And actually, so often, those are about bigger world issues. Like the Napoleonic Wars were going on, and she references them, but we don't always pick up on things like that. And I do think that there's a sort of a lot of work to be done to kind of redress her image in a way, to kind of make people understand that yes, she's writing about small groups of people living in country villages. They are small domestic settings, but she is not blinkered and blocking things out. She's just presenting things as, you know, as they were, as people lived them. So there's an understanding that things are going on a long way over there in other countries, but you don't necessarily spend your whole life talking about them if you're at home and the newspapers only come once a week. I mean, that's just sort of not. We know we're just so much more tuned into world events today.
Completely, and I think that's a really interesting point. The idea that you would have been aware of these wider world events. They would have occasionally come into your consciousness, just as they occasionally pop up into the novel, particularly when these kind of large world forces are shaping your day-to-day life. But at the same time, you're not hyper-connected. You're not constantly getting news of what's happening elsewhere. You're waiting for letters. That's the pace at which...
Exactly. And she had brothers in the Navy and the Army, and they would hear from them and they would know what was going on. But it was obviously weeks beforehand, because everything took such a long time to filter through.
Yeah, completely. Gosh, I mean, I could just keep chatting about Jane Austen's life and world with you all day, but I think we should probably start moving towards wrapping up. Otherwise, it could end up being accidentally a 2-hour video. So one thing I did want to ask you was, is this your dream job? And did you always know that it was your dream job? And how did you come to have it? What was your sort of journey to this point?
Well, I actually first came to the museum, I think when I was about 17. My godmother brought me. And it was very different in those days. And I don't think at that time I had any idea about working in museums. So I'm not sure it would have been my dream job from then. But I'm sort of really glad that I did come when I was quite young, and it was sort of been part of my consciousness for a while. I sort of slightly fell into working in museums. I studied English and literature and theatre, and then I studied creative writing, which was really wonderful and, you know, enriching, but didn't lead into a specific career. And I then rather fell into a job at the V&A, and I ended up sort of clinging on there for dear life, and I ended up staying there for 10 years working in the theatre and performance department.
Which fabulous.
It was fabulous. It was incredibly fun, and I did all sorts of projects which involved making people angry. So sort of being naughty, I think, really doing lots of performance events in the museum. I ran festivals and all sorts of things that kind of disrupted the normal running of the museum. But I learned so much there, and I was involved with lots of really exciting projects. So my department was doing things like the David Bowie exhibition and the Pink Floyd exhibition, and things that were sort of really sort of huge and just cutting edge and sort of bringing all sorts of different creatives, and it was a really exciting time. And then I saw this job advertised, and I'd been at the V&A 10 years, and I felt like maybe it was time to have a change. And it was like going from, you know, the most enormous place where, I mean, like 1,000 people at the V&A,
right,
to the tiniest. So at the time, Jane Austen's house, I think, had about 15 staff. And I mean, today it is even smaller. I think we have 5 or 6 full sort of, you know, staff. And then there are extra people who front of house and things like that. But it's really tiny. And I think I have actually I've benefited from that so much, because it is completely different and it's so hands-on, and you just, anything that has to be done, you just basically have to do it yourself. So yeah, in a way, I think it is my dream job, and it has allowed me to move to Hampshire, which is wonderful. So yeah,
wonderful. And I can see how it's having a sense that almost the museum is yours, and that you have to do the things and make the things happen. That must be really exciting. And have you always been a Jane Austen fan, or is that a more recent development?
I have, and I'm not going to be ashamed about this, actually, but I think I can definitely date my love of Jane Austen to 1995.
Oh yeah,
when we all can. And actually, that is another really funny and interesting point in the sort of history of the museum, is that 1995 was kind of a sort of, it was called Austen Mania at the time. There was the BBC Pride and Prejudice, but there were a number of other films and adaptations that came out that year. And there was this explosion of love of Jane Austen. And the museum's visitor numbers doubled that year.
Wow.
And have sort of stayed up there. So actually, even though it sort of seems like a bit of a joke, the BBC Pride and Prejudice changed Austen history, I think. Certainly changed the Jane Austen house history, because I think it just made people see that this was something that they could relate to and fall in love with, and it kind of just brought her back, and
kind of opened up that world.
We're still feeling the effects of that, which is amazing.
That is amazing. And do you have a favourite Austen novel? Is it Pride and Prejudice, or is it something else?
Oh, it's so difficult. I don't know. I regularly tell people it's all sorts of different things. I think possibly it might be Persuasion, because I grew up just outside Bath, and as a sort of teenager, I really enjoyed reading a novel set in Bath, because I really sort of related to it so much. I understood where they were and what it looked like and everything like that. And it is just an extraordinary novel. It's so beautiful. It feels that bit more mature and sort of, you know, calm. It's not quite the giddy. Yeah. So I do love that one, but I love them all. They're all fantastic.
Me too. Gosh, and I love how your life story is kind of all in relation to locations where Austen lived.
Yes, I'm following her about. Yeah.
Yes. Wonderful. And then just before we wrap up, I feel I should return to a point you mentioned earlier, which is you mentioned the roof being replaced in the 1950s, was it? And said you were going to come back to that. Yeah.
So we are running a campaign at the moment to raise money to re-roof Jane Austen's house, because it is now about 70 years since it was last done, and it's really not in great shape. There are a number of bits of work to be done on Jane Austen's house, but it's very difficult. It's a Grade 1 listed building. There are bats in the attic, which makes everything harder and more expensive. And we're open. I mean, we're actually not open at the moment, but in normal circumstances, we're open all year round. So it is a really.
We're filming this in lockdown 3.
Which is why we're not there, which would have been much nicer. So we are fundraising. We've been incredibly lucky. We've got the Hampshire County Council are supporting us. We've been running a public fundraising campaign, which is doing really well. We do need a bit more, but we've got enough to start work now, which is brilliant. So we'll be starting to get the wheels turning for that. But yeah, it's really important that we get it done.
Okay, wonderful. So if anyone who's watching this video wants to donate to that, we will pop the link underneath. Lovely, so that you can do so that Jane Austen's House Museum stays open for posterity and we can all go and visit it when such things are allowed again.
Please do, once that's possible again. Yeah.
And then my final question is rather a cruel question that we put to everyone at the end of every Bitlit, but we're aware that it's completely unanswerable. So it's up, just answer it in whatever way springs to mind. And that is, what is literature for you?
Oh my goodness. I think when it's literature. I think it's just brilliant writing. It's when something is crafted and you just know it's something that you feel. And I completely subscribe to the idea that it's different for different people. It doesn't have to be something that is marked as this is literature. You know how they do in bookshops, like this is literature and this is,
genre fiction
crap.
When in fact Austen in her way wrote genre fiction. And
exactly. And obviously, I mean, I want people to read. That's part of the museum's mission, certainly, is to get people reading, and not just Jane Austen, but anything is a good start. So I want people to read anything. But as someone who has occasionally, indulged in I don't know whether chick lit is or, whatever, things that aren't very well written, you can read a book like that, or maybe you read a few books like that and you race through them and you can kind of just sort of gorge on them and go through really quickly, and then you sort of feel a bit I've really had that with books that are basically the equivalent of fast food. Like, you sort of feel like they're sort of satisfying a kind of, a bit of a need, but then actually they're not wholesome. I think maybe that's what I think literature is. It's something that is fulfilling and it makes you feel stronger and better, and it sets you up for life. And it's true. I think that there's a truth in really great literature, certainly, and there's so much of it out there, and that's what's so wonderful, is it's not just the kind of classics. There are people writing today who are absolutely fantastic and in all sorts of genres, and they could be writing romances or mysteries or whatever. Like, there are if you're a brilliant writer, you could write any kind of thing, and it would have that kind of depth to it that I think literature has.
Yeah, thank you. What a lovely, inspiring answer to end on. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. I've learned such a lot. It's been a delight to chat to you.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you.